Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the NSP Plus Think Tank Summit, Prospect for a Resilient Indo-Pacific Policy. Did you enjoy lunch? Yes? All right. I hope that you're energized because we have more sessions and interesting topics to share with all of you. Now we're going to move on to session 3, Non-Red Supply Chain Enhancing Indo-Pacific Connectivity Beyond Authoritarian Dependencies. This session focuses on strengthening secure, diversified supply chains and reducing strategic vulnerabilities. Our speakers will explore practical ways to build trusted networks and deepen regional connectivity, ensuring the Indo-Pacific remains resilient and independent in the face of authoritarian pressure. Joining us on the stage, we have our moderator, Xianming Lian, President of Zhonghua Institution for Economic Research, Taiwan. Please welcome our moderator with a warm round of applause. And also joining us are the speakers. First, let's welcome Harsh V. Pant, Vice President of Observer Research Foundation, India. Andrew Ye, Executive Director of China Strategic Risk Institute, United Kingdom. Welcome. Yuren Guo, Vice President of Institute for National Policy Research, Taiwan. Marcin Jerzewski, Head of Taiwan Office European Value Center for Security Policy, Czech Republic, and Fellow of Visgard Grad Insight, Poland. And Jeremy Zhicheng Chang, CEO of Research Institute for Democracy, Society, and Emerging Technology, Taiwan. Now I would like to give the floor to our moderator.
Welcome, distinguished guests and all the participants for this session. So today we are very honored to have 5 panelists to join the section. So the title for this section, Non-Red Supply Chain Enhancing Indo-Pacific Connectivity Beyond the Authoritarian Dependence. So let's start with Harsh. And I know that you are experts on the geopolitics, and so can you just give us some understanding and overview about the Indo-Pacific strategy, and particularly in this region, I think India plays a key role. What do you think about the strategy that can be adopted to enhance the Indo-Pacific stability?
Thanks so much, and thank you to Taiwan-Asia Exchange Foundation, Chairman Shao, Alan, for having me here. It has been a great partnering with the foundation, and we look forward as part of Observer Research Foundation to working more closely with them. On Indo-Pacific, as we have been discussing since the morning, has been a strategic geography that has evolved very, very rapidly, both in terms of the way countries have adopted this geography as a metaphor for their strategic positioning, but also as a concrete reality for most countries in the region. And we have been talking about China since the morning, and I think without China, there would not have been any Indo-Pacific. So in that sense, we have to acknowledge the role that China has played in bringing not only an awareness about this geography being a strategic cohesive whole, but also in terms of the opportunities that it has created to bring like-minded countries together. Because if you can imagine a situation if Chinese were behaving slightly differently, then a lot of these conversations would have a very different texture to what we are discussing. But the Chinese behavior, their aggression, their assertiveness has also led to a point where like-minded partners have to come together and have been almost forced to reckon that they have to come and work together. And in that context, from India's vantage point, India had been traditionally used to thinking more in terms of Indian Ocean as its most important periphery. And there the contribution of Shinzo Abe in particular for redefining in contemporary terms what Indo-Pacific means, and bringing India to the center stage of this conversation has been very, very important. Because I think when he was talking about when he started talking about Indo-Pacific, when he talked about this idea of the Indo-Pacific, he was doing 2 things. He was asking India to be more present in East and Southeast Asia, And he was asking East and Southeast Asia to acknowledge India's role in the wider geography, not simply as an Indian Ocean power, but as a power that can bridge this divide between Indian Ocean and Pacific Oceans. And I think in that sense, India sits at the center of this geography. And for India, therefore, it is important, and what some of the issues here pertaining to that discussion today, that a comprehensive Indo-Pacific strategy is important. We have been talking about democracy, and I think Vice Admiral Chauhan mentioned it very correctly, that India and Taiwan, by their very existence, are in some ways demonstrate to China the futility of pursuing certain kinds of pathways in terms of the policy responses. But irrespective of that, China has been doing certain things. So the question becomes that, can we play up the democracy factor in the strategy? And I think that is what has been discussed since the morning. That, look, sometimes as democracies, we are too harsh on ourselves. And we keep on complaining, how bad things are. But I think we need to tell the story of how we have actually done a good job. India, for example, one of the poorest countries in the world when it started off, no one believed, and at that time, people like Sam Huntington were writing that India will never be a successful democracy because it's so poor, there are so many inequalities in the system, there are all kinds of inequalities. And yet we have persisted, we have performed. Today, India is, by different measures, third or fourth largest global economy. That's not a bad record, and I think Taiwan's record equally is very interesting. Despite all the adversities, despite all the challenges, it continues to struggle on. And I think that's the story we need to tell, that of course, China looks very sexy, very efficient, it is performing very, very credibly, but it doesn't mean that our stories need not be told in the manner that they should have been told. And I think somewhere we become, and I think when we look at the Western world, for example, we also have to acknowledge the problems that the West created, first in building up China and in building up this model, and not acknowledging that there were other models available. They may not be as perfect, they were not perhaps as as efficient, but they were there. They were also struggling. But I think that binary that was created has led to a situation where I think the democracy and the success of democracies in Indo-Pacific has not been played up. And I think that is important as the first part, and the other part, of course, and we can come to it later, that a resilient democracy, a resilient Indo-Pacific, as we have been talking about, a secure Indo-Pacific, as we have been talking about, would require like-minded countries to work with each other, acknowledging each other's weaknesses, but also building up each other's successes.
Okay, so Andrew, you are experts on China. So how do you think about China's, we know that China has made the Southeast Sea, the inlands of China Sea. So how do you think about it, how Indo-Pacific countries should join to work together against this kind of the threat?
Thank you. Well, thank you, TAF, for hosting this excellent event. I mean, I think I'm probably more qualified to speak on it from the kind of European and UK perspective in terms of how we're perceiving China's threats in the region and what that means, particularly for supply chain resilience, which is what we're talking about today. So let me just highlight, I guess, two quick factors in terms of what is changing some of the ways in which Europe is engaging with the region. So the first one to highlight, and I want to do this because I think this element sometimes goes ignored a little bit on this side of the world, but increasing alignment between Russia and China is a massive factor in how European countries are beginning to approach the China issue. I think there's a real difference if you look at Indo-Pacific strategies published pre and post Russia's invasion of Ukraine from European countries. Those which are published pre the invasion of Ukraine tend to be much more optimistic about the Indo-Pacific as primarily a trade opportunity, an investment opportunity. Those published after tend to be much more cognizant of what could go wrong, of the risks to supply chains, the risks to security, the risk to global stability. And I think that's for two main reasons. Firstly, it's the sense that kind of as Russia escalates its grey zone threats against Europe, China is more and more coming in as a willing support. So whether that is looking at incidents, for example, of suspected sabotage to undersea cables where Chinese ships or Chinese companies have been involved in some of those incidents in Europe, whether it's looking at the growing number of cyber attacks against European critical infrastructure, again, the origin of some of which is suspected to be Chinese as well as Russian. So in all of this, there is the question of, as Europe's grey zone or even open warfare with Russia escalates, does that mean that Europe will face escalating grey zone threats from China as well? And then that has huge ramifications then for how European public and private actors think about their supply chains. Because can they still trust China to supply reliable and safe supply chains at a time when Europe's greatest adversary in Russia is being heavily supported by China? So that's kind of the first question. And then the second question is around Taiwan, and in particular growing European concern about China's escalations around Taiwan. And again, this is absolutely critical for supply chains, not just to semiconductors, which we all know about, but the broader trade flowing through the region. And again, the question is, well, if we do see escalating contingencies over Taiwan, how much can Europe rely on Chinese supply chains, and how much can Europe expect to receive retaliation from China in the form of grey zone warfare if it is going to join with the US in, for example, sanctioning China economically? So I think both of those questions ultimately feed through to this topic we're discussing today about supply chain resilience as well.
Okay, great. The next one is Yuren Guo, and I know that you are experts on Japan, and Japan just had the first female prime minister, and she is also a mentee of the Abe, who is a big supporter for the Indo-Pacific relation. Can you just tell us a little bit about how that election result is going to change or to affect the Indo-Pacific stability?
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thank you for having me for this topic, supply chain resilience. But before talking about the situation of the new, Takaichi-san is right now the president of LDP, but not yet the president or prime minister of Japan yet. So I'll follow the previous two speakers' opinion about supply chain resilience, or this so-called non-rate supply chain. First of all, let's try to look back like 2 decades when, 2014, when Russian invasion to Crimea, Germany still insisted to continue the Nord Stream #2 pipeline plan. That time, the U.S. ambassador warning German government, the danger of continuing this Nord Stream 2. What I'm trying to say is the globalization without consideration of political and security risk, that is very dangerous. That's number one. And number two, if you look at what happened 2015 when the U.S. forces decided to deploy START system in South Korea. And that was the first time China, at very large scale, to weaponize its trade against South Korea. And then the following year is to the Philippines. And if you look at 2013, because of the island dispute, Diaoyu Senkaku Island dispute between China and Japan, China again weaponized its trade against Japan as well. And not to mention about Taiwan. Because of ECFA, China usually use trade measure for economic coercion against Taiwan as well. And looking at 2018, there was the Trump administration for the first time waging trade war against China. And by following by Biden administration, this is so-called like small yard and high fence. This technological war against China. And not to mention right now, 2025, we have tariff war from the States to almost every single country on this planet. So if you look at all these threats to supply chain, we reach to the conclusion, number one, the importance of geopolitics, especially very dynamic geopolitics. And number two is this great power struggle between the United States and China. And number three is, of course, these autocracies, irrational ambition against democracies. And number four is the weaponization of trade measures. Yeah. So what we discuss here, so-called non-rate, I will not, directly link this rate is only linking to China. But this non-rate supply chain more like referring to number one, rule-based, because as the examples I just mentioned, there was no rule-based at all. And number two is, of course, like-minded. That's second element. And number three is de-risking. Okay. So that reflects to the chair's question on the possible new Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi. When she was the Minister of Economic Security of Japan, she was pushing for four things, four policies during her term. Number one is a very comprehensive survey on Japanese supply chain, and especially industrial and economic dependency on China. So Japan spent years to do a very comprehensive survey to see to what degree Japan is depending on China, on trade and on industry. And number two is the critical infrastructure. So during her term, she did a very comprehensive survey and conclude to a report on all these very important infrastructure relating to supply chain. And number three is high-tech development. So things including like robotics, AI, quantum computing, that was also concluded during her term. And number four is this non-transparent, non-publicized of particular protective patterns. As democracies, we all know transparency and accountability are the elements, the pillars for democracies. But for self-protection, Japanese Diet passed a special measure to protect certain patents classified as critical technology to the security of Japan. So those are the four major measures during Takaichi as the Minister of Economic Security. Yeah.
So Marcin, I think the EU right now, actually Europe has a war with, Ukraine has a war with Russia. So how that affect your view about the supply chain? What do you think about the Indo-Pacific countries should be concerned about?
Thank you very much, and big thanks to the Taiwan-Asia Exchange Foundation for having me here. The European Values Center for Security Policy is the first European think tank to have established a permanent office in Taiwan, so it's really a great honor to be a part of this ecosystem that TAF is so effectively curating, albeit with a small caveat. Sitting on this manel, I would hope to see more efforts towards gender balance in future iterations of this event. In your question, moderator, you already hint at the duality of challenges that the European Union is currently facing as it tries to navigate a possible recalibration of common foreign and security policy and common defense and security policy. Namely, with the largest conventional kinetic war on the European continent since the end of World War II, there is, of course, a call to action in our immediate neighborhood. Nevertheless, we also see a growing push to engage effectively under the aegis of the principle of principled pragmatism with the Indo-Pacific region. And whenever we talk about a European posture towards any entity or in any policy area, specifically here in the Indo-Pacific context, we have to understand that we are operating within a really labyrinthine framework of multi-level governance. So the nuances of European approach might be different when we look at them at the bloc level, and they might be different when we look at them at the level of individual member states. And indeed, if we try to understand simultaneously at these two levels what is the European posture towards the Indo-Pacific, we can see that it is a mosaic, an ongoing conversation, and amalgam of different approaches. Nevertheless, we see two common elements thereof. The first one, whether we're talking about the EU as the bloc or member states in the western part of the continent that have more historic connections to the Indo-Pacific region, for example, through colonial legacies, or whether we look at member states in Central and Eastern Europe that perhaps do not have this historical legacy of exposure to the region, they all realize that Indo-Pacific matters. So we have an Indo-Pacific strategy at the level of the EU, which I think is interesting also in the context of the report that TAF put together and that Dr. Yang presented this morning. We have several Indo-Pacific strategies at the levels of member states. And this brings me to the second point about the commonality. In many ways, an analysis, a comparative analysis of these strategies at the level of member states exposes the ongoing conversation about balancing economic and security logics in engagements with the Indo-Pacific region. Because particularly in the 1990s, when we first started to benefit from the peace dividend, the logic of trade dominated over the logic of security in these engagements. Now, we see a reversal, and that is extremely important for understanding EU's engagements with the Indo-Pacific region in an effort to build what we refer to as the non-red supply chains. And even though the conversation in Europe is embracing the efforts to construct non-red supply chains in strategic areas such as semiconductors or drones that have direct implications for the situation in Ukraine, I would encourage us all to perhaps shift the conversation a little bit to critical raw materials, access to which continues to be one of the biggest challenges experienced by the European Union at this point. And we are also seeing a growing number of agreements between the EU and Indo-Pacific countries, including two that are very well represented in this room today, Japan and Australia, on developing or reducing dependencies on China in critical raw materials. With Japan, we witnessed the signing of the MOU between the European Union and JOGMEC in July 2023. Now there's an ongoing conversation about potential joint procurement. Australia emerges as another important partner in building European non-red supply chains for critical raw materials. Earlier this year, the European Commission announced 13 strategic projects for CRM excavations in third countries, meaning outside of the EU. 3 out of the 13 are actually controlled by Australian companies in countries as diverse as Madagascar, Kazakhstan, and Serbia. So those linkages are natural here. And I'm conscious of the time, but whether we are talking about critical raw materials or other ways in which the EU is trying to deploy its connectivity strategies in the Indo-Pacific region, Taiwan matters as well. And I would like to shed light particularly on the Global Gateway Initiative, the flagship connectivity and infrastructure initiative launched by the European Union that focuses on 5 main areas: digital, climate and energy, transport, health, and research and education. And following the call of the European Parliament in its resolution from 2022, we should explore the synergies that are already there between the New Southbound policy and the Global Gateway Initiative for flexible technical inclusion of Taiwan in this strategic connectivity effort. Thank you.
Okay, Jeremy. So you are the CEO of the DSAT, and I want to ask you about the, what do you think about the Indo-Pacific stability, how that's going to affect the supply chain resilience, and what can Taiwan contribute to this aspect?
Yeah, well, thanks so much, moderator. This is my great privilege and honor to be invited here to speak on behalf of DSAT. So since DSAT is one of the youngest national think tank that created by Taiwanese government in the end of 2023, so we are focusing our research on the supply chain issue, but on the supply chain issue that related to economic security and national security. So based on our research findings, first of all, we have to understand, we have to disclose why the Chinese ecosystem can be so functional to wipe out the rivalries in Western countries. We've been, experiencing the second China shock, so the first China shock obviously was in the beginning of the 90s, and then when everybody was investing in China and building up the manufacturing centers there in China, so all the Western countries got de-industrialized. But this was the first China shock. The second China shock was really pretty undergoing and phenomenon that Chinese is not only manufacturing the general manufacturing sectors, they are dominating each of the strategical sectors now, and in a very effective way. I'm not going to say it's a very efficient way, but it's a very effective way. So looking back to 10 years ago when Chinese government announced the Made in China 2025 strategy, and this year actually is the year of 2025. And so when you are looking their policy goals for dominating this kind of strategical industrial sectors, they almost achieve these goals. They've been dominating not only the car manufacturing industry, ship making industry, but also even panel industry, battery industry, and pharmaceutical industry as well. And they become more and more rapidly to replace the Western rivalries in their way. So we try to disclose what happened, what's the strategy that adopted by the Chinese government or the private sectors there, and why the Chinese ecosystem be so efficient, and what are the strategies that we can counter this kind of Chinese strategy. So in the end, so if you are interested in, I'm leveraging my time to promote our research products. So this is this is an English project, English report. So we titled it "The Great Siege," the PRC's comprehensive strategy to dominate the foundational chips. So we're trying to disclose the ecosystem there in China and identify the Chinese way inside their ecosystem, because they're actually, although they cannot define as a market economy, but they are so efficiently or effectively to use the multiple stakeholders inside the governmental sectors, subsidies, and private sectors to build up a Chinese pseudo-IDM ecosystem and to wipe out their rivalries. On the other hand, I think Taiwan, so what the niches that Taiwan still have, right? We cannot compete with the scale. We cannot compete with the price that provided by our Chinese rivalries. So all the other countries like Taiwan, we cannot compete directly with China as well. I think this is the common challenge. But what kind of a niche that Taiwan has? I think there's like three. The first of all, Taiwan has a niche. Especially because we've been industrialized Taiwan's economy by shaping Taiwan to become a hardware contract manufacturing ecosystem. So most of the Taiwanese suppliers are SMEs, but they are specifically providing with their niche services for supplying the electronic components. So this become comparatively efficient to compete and to survive with their Chinese rivalries. The second thing is the scale. Not only Taiwan is a very kind of a champion for these SMEs occupy different kind of niche industrial sectors, but also the traditional way for Taiwan, and more and more frequently to be mentioned, is Taiwanese ODMs. Right, Foxconn, Quanta, Wistron, so these five brothers. So they are traditional. What kind of a service they've been doing? So they've been doing the supply chain integration services for their clients to scale up the capacity for their own products. And so this is kind of an efficient way, because given this ODM companies, they have become more and more growing up to a global scale. So they got the many know-hows to integrate or to manage the supply chain in most of the efficient way, so that they can still be very competitive for supplying their clients there in the Silicon Valley, especially. So this is the Taiwan's niche as well. And the last part might be the future potential. I think the dual-use industry. Because the dual-use industry, we accomplished several of research products, so mostly about the drone industry. Because we believe that the dual-use industry is going to redefine the future of the market, as well as the innovation in the near future. Previously, the commercial use has the largest scale. But if the drones or if the robotics, humanoid robotics, be seen as the most potentially profitable topic for the Western investors to be invested in, to join this game. And then there is a huge potential for the new industry to be scaled up. But the foundation of the industry is still, again, Taiwan has an ICT contract manufacturing ecosystem here. So Taiwan can help with scaling up. So this is Taiwan's strength, right? And Taiwan can help. Yeah.
Okay, great. I think that all of you have talked a little bit about the importance of the supply chains and how that Indo-Pacific affect Indo-Pacific stability. I want to actually move to the second question, which is we all agree that China is very dominant in this region, particularly in the manufacturing. And so one possibility is for the Indo-Pacific country to work together and in some particular security-related industry. However, it's very, very difficult actually to establish a non-red, what we call the supply chains. And so I want to start from the Jeremy this time so you have, I know that DSA has worked on the report about the drones, which talked about that how to actually produce or to establish a non-red supply chains of the drone. And can you just tell us about the challenges that actually face in order to establish this kind of the non-red supply chain for drones?
Yeah, the challenges for Taiwan, especially for private sectors, is we still don't have the market there. So most of, especially the semiconductor companies, right? Because I think Taiwan's most valuable part is still the semiconductors. And, you know, I think it's kind of an emerging trend. So given the current challenge for Taiwan, and I think for all the other Western countries in terms of the drone industry is the same, because the DJI is dominating the drone supply chain. We cannot compete with DJI because DJI has the largest market share. And so they are not only dominating the end products, because I mentioned so Chinese ecosystem is like a pseudo IDM. It's a vertical integration of ecosystem. So because DJI is there, and it's the suppliers for DJI that can also control the cost and making sure that they have a market, they have clients. So whatever components we want to supply with the non-DJI or non-Chinese drone supply chain, then we have to face the current challenge that we don't have end clients. The clients doesn't have the market scale, and the market, the consumers are not interested in buying expensive drones compared to the DJI's drones. But how to solve these problems? I just previously mentioned about there are three solutions, right? Niches, scales, and regulation. Why regulation is important? Because drone is a dual-use technology. Drone is not iPhone. iPhone, if you are investing in iPhone, if you are the participant as a supplier for iPhone, and you need a global scale, because iPhone is a global scale commercial use product. But drones, from the day one, drones is, of course, it's commercial, but then it's a dual use. Whenever there's a dual use topic, and that will be possible to adopt more regulation or more control by each of the Western governments. because we don't want to purchase DJI drones. We don't want to purchase Chinese components to be put into the Western drone systems, especially the connected function drone chips and other critical components as well. So if the Western countries, Indo-Pacific democracies want to scale up its industry, so dual use or defense, and then the next step is defense use industry. It's absolutely should be targeted by especially the policymakers. I mean, you have to incentivize the private sectors to join your game, and then somebody should try to define the market in the future. If the market is just defined by the market itself, we never capable of be joined. But if we can redefine, because the future of our world is going to be more and more geopoliticalized. Everybody is trying to weaponize it. Everybody is trying to leverage its own supply chain. Everybody is preparing for the next potential of the world. And then I mentioned again, dual-use drones will be the next potential. In Taiwan, of course, we are facing the challenge, but I'm kind of optimistic about the future of Taiwan's drones, especially if you look at the trade data, and our export of drones to the foreign countries has been dramatically increased, especially the major destination is Poland and European countries. Most of the end use is in the battlefield of Ukraine. Why? Because I don't think the Ukrainian, Polish, or Europeans want to purchase if they can have choice. Now maybe most of the European purchasers doesn't have choice, but if they have choice, I think they're better to scale up the European capacity or scale up the capacity there in like-minded countries for this drone industry. So Taiwan is currently facing a really changing moment for our suppliers in the ICT component supply chain to be participated in this game. And the game is changing now, so we've been witnessing this trend. We're looking forward to more and more collaboration with the like-minded countries there, not only in the Pacific, also I think in the global scale, Europeans and America.
Mercy, do you agree? What's your perspective? How do you think about the challenge to establish the non-red supply chain?
In general, when the European Union deals with economic security questions, we once again encounter questions about the raison d'etre of European Union institutions functioning at the bloc level, and some of these conversations may seem very opaque to everyone trying to look inside the Brussels bubble from the outside, but nevertheless, these conversations are important to make sure that we are all on the same page. So on the one hand, with questions of economic security, we are dealing with the issue of divergent risk assessments, the perception of the severity of the current situation with the ongoing full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, and also the growing convergence of strategic interests between Beijing and Moscow resonates very differently in places like Estonia or Poland, which are border states responsible for safeguarding the external border of not only the European Union but also the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, than they might in places like Spain or Portugal, where dealing with China might seem like a good, viable deal, and simply by virtue of geography, the threat of kinetic confrontation does not seem as immediate. So, but then beyond the threat perception, so a more subjective factor that could be reshaped in the a very constructivist way of looking at dealings in the international space, there are also very concrete legal ramifications. So economic security is very much a political hot potato in the European context, given the provisions of European treaties that provide for division of labor between EU-level institutions and member states. So while trade policy remains an exclusive competence of EU institutions, that is a part of sovereignty that member states willingly delegate away to Brussels, then the questions of security and defense policy are often considered to be a part of the mandate of member states. That is why it is very difficult to in the very beginning, agree on the scope of action that can be undertaken at joint EU level in the context of trade being this exclusive competence. Precisely because ever since we began the process of European integration with the European coal and steel community, we are continuously in the soul-searching phase, even though it's been over 7 decades, about the final, ideal, most optimal shape of the European project. So a lot of conceptual conversations, but this is the reality of these conversations taking place in Brussels. And then indeed, I think that in many conversations that are focused on creating non-red supply chains, there is a dichotomy of choosing between solutions that might be more secure and more sustainable in the long run, and simultaneously the pressure to meet very concrete policy objectives that have harder deadlines. And I think that if we look at procurement of technologies that are supposed to facilitate green transition and that are supposed to help member states meet their net zero commitments and in general climate goals, an area where we increasingly see growing transatlantic divergence rather than convergence, this dichotomy is very well illustrated. So, for example, Chinese producers of solar panels and components for solar panels are essentially outpricing everybody else. That's why in what has now become very much a core component of European critical infrastructure, we see tremendous dependencies on China. And particularly in light of the ironclad friendship between China and Russia, we anticipate that, and that has been tested by many organizations, including us at EVC in tabletop exercises and wargaming simulations, that the infrastructure of solar energy production in Europe could be very vulnerable in case of a Russian escalation against the eastern flank countries of NATO. So several factors to consider here. Many of them might appear to be more of a political philosophy discussion than actual concrete policy deliberation, but that's EU for you.
Okay, Yuan.
Yeah.
So you talked about that non-red supply chain may not just be the non-China, but the rule-based. So what do you think about how we can improve, or what are your suggestions to help to establish the non-red supply chain in the Indo-Pacific regions?
Thank you, Chair, again. Let me share a story with you. I was at Vietnam, Hanoi for a meeting last month. And when I entered the custom, there was no photo or no fingerprint machine at custom. And I was quite curious. So when we had a meeting at the Border Commission of Vietnamese government, I asked them this question. How come you guys don't have these machines at your border? And then they were like, we don't want to collect big data for China. Because they say 99% of the machines, cameras, fingerprint machine, are all made in China. So everything, all these biological evidences you collect, you are collecting that not for yourselves, it's for China. And number two, I just came back from Toronto this morning. I was there to attend a conference at Canadian Asia Pacific Foundation. I was there to make presentation about Chinese sabotage to undersea cable surrounding Taiwan. I don't know if all the guests present here, do you have idea how many times Taiwan's cables got sabotaged per cable per year? The global average is 0.1 to 0.2 times per year per cable. But in case of Taiwan, it's 5 to 7 times per cable per year. that's like 15 times more than global average. But the reason why I want to bring this up is we are democracies, and China sees us through. Democracies always have problem cooperating to each other domestically, and we do have problem cooperating to each other, and China knows that. That's the reason they could infiltrate, they could penetrate into our democratic system. So I was using this undersea cable as example. Taiwan connects to 14 international undersea cable, 10 domestic. Whenever this year alone is already 6 times sabotage, by China. But the problem is every time you got undersea cable sabotage, all the countries surrounding Taiwan, including Japan, South Korea, believing it is Taiwan's problem. So I'm here to share with you. I fully agree with what Jeremy just mentioned. I'm quite pessimistic. The reason because collective action is the only way out for us facing Chinese threat. But the problem is, as democracies, we don't even have like awareness building mechanism among us. We don't have consensus building mechanism among us. So it is not just like economic security issues, but also if you look at all these gray zone tactics, gray zone operation, China been waging against all its neighboring countries, including South Korea at Yellow Sea, Japan at East China Sea, Taiwan at Taiwan Strait, the Philippines at South China Sea, and Indian Ocean, everywhere. And we are not talking to each other, not mentioning about cooperation. We don't even have consensus building mechanism among democracies. So I believe collective action is the only solution for us, regardless how confident you are or we are. I was at Outward at Toronto for conferences, and we got representatives, of course, from Canada, from Australia, and from Mongolia. All the countries present there talking about their critical mineral strategy. They've been monopolized by China for a long time. Yeah, and again, democracies are, not only not cooperating to each other, but not talking to each other, or do this consensus building, and I believe it is very dangerous. So if you want to understand all this Chinese penetration, infiltration, the mastermind is this guy called Wang Hunin. He wrote this book called America Against America. It's basically using our weaknesses of democracies to go against us. So as a think tank operator at Institute for National Policy Research, INPR, we established a team 4 years ago. I mean, right after the COVID, including we have cooperation with Sear, with chip maker UMC, and also Taising Financial Holdings. So we are doing this cross-area, cross-entity kind of cooperation to each other in order to do risk assessment. So we called this risk assessment team. The reason for doing this risk assessment is for de-risking. But de-risking is not the purpose. De-risking is for us to understand our weaknesses so that we could do consensus building better and have collective action better. Thank you.
Okay. Andrew, I know that you have done a lot of research on the green energy industry. And this is also another industry which is China actually dominates. So can you tell us what's the challenge if we want to use a non-red supply chain in this kind of the industry, according to your experience?
Thank you. Yeah, well, I think some of the key elements have been mentioned already, but I think broadly speaking, if we're thinking about integrating Chinese technology into critical national infrastructure, whether that's energy or any other sector, I like to think about it in terms of three different types of risk. So there's the obvious one, which is dependency risk. So China's ability to use its dominance of a supply chain to cut off critical goods, cut off critical components, which then allows for coercive pressure. And we've seen China use that very effectively on critical minerals, which Martin, I think, mentioned earlier as well. The second is an espionage threat, and that comes back to the point around collecting biometric data, for example, at airports and so on. It's what is the risk that China is able to use this technology to gain access to either national security sensitive or personally sensitive information. And then the third area is sabotage, which is the danger that by integrating the Chinese technology, you leave vulnerabilities open for China to exploit by cyber attack or other known vulnerabilities that could then undermine your critical infrastructure. So bringing it back to the point around green energy, well, how do you mitigate for these risks if you are integrating Chinese green energy into your supply chain? And as was raised earlier, I think Jeremy used the phrase countries which have the choice, right? So countries which have the choice may not have any Chinese components within their energy supply chains, but actually most countries are not in that position because, whether we're talking about solar or wind or lithium batteries, many other aspects of the green technology supply chain, the cheapest, most reliable and quickest way to get that is from China. So a couple of ideas of how some of these risks can be mitigated. I think one concept to try and think about is splitting energy generation from kind of grid management or grid control. So maybe having kind of Chinese assets, whether that is your solar PV, for example, generating the electricity, that is one risk, but obviously if that is then linked into your overall ability to control the grid, if China is, for example, able to turn off certain plants or to create surges, which could then damage the rest of the grid, that is a much bigger problem. So actually separating out those two components and talking about grid management, which happens with trusted vendors and trusted suppliers and trusted technologies, while being able to separate out power generation assets, which might be made with Chinese hardware, that might be one effective risk mitigation measure. Of course, that's not possible for every technology, but where possible, I think trying to think about Chinese hardware and Chinese software as separate problems when it comes to risk is quite a helpful one. And then the second area, which was mentioned on one of the panels earlier this morning, is contingency planning. And kind of, are you prepared for the worst case scenario? And maybe you can integrate so much Chinese tech into your power systems such that, for example, if 20% of it goes down, that's okay because you have enough backup or you have enough reserve in other areas. But that then does put an upper limit to how much Chinese tech you are able to integrate because there's only so far that contingency planning can take you. So those are just, I think, two areas to think about in terms of the green tech supply chain and how do we kind of, where we have to integrate Chinese tech safely while still maintaining that broader point around energy security.
Thank you. Harsh, that goes back to the last one. So India, I think a lot of the people think that India probably the key country which can help with the non-China or non-red supply chain. What do you think about this perspective? And also that we just, we talked a little bit that Marty and Trump doesn't seem to have a good relationship at this point. And what do you think that's going to affect the establishment of the non-red supply chain?
Well, I think it's safe to assume that Mr. Trump doesn't have very many friends. So Mr. Modi used to be, it seemed at one point, a good friend. But today, I think they still call each other friends on X, but not anything, nothing more than that. Because I think the relationship has moved on, and Mr. Trump's policies have certainly created an environment where it is very difficult to look at the trend lines positively. And I think that is, once again, the point that was raised about a certain sense of pessimism. I'm also pessimistic about the ability of democracies to work together, particularly in this respect, because creating supply chains is a long-term process. It is not going to happen overnight. And what started happening post-COVID, some very positive developments in that regard, because suddenly there was a consciousness in India, in the region, that look, the economic model has not really worked. And you have to give credit also to Mr. Trump's first term, where I think he single-handedly made the West realize how dependent the West had become on a certain narrative, on a certain economic structure, which was making it difficult to have a balanced relationship with China. And I think he single-handedly shifted the discourse on China in his first term. I think Europe would not have done anything if Mr. Trump had not been the way he came on board with his ideas and the way he shifted the discourse on China. So I think the fact that if the writing was on the wall, it took so many disruptions, COVID, a Trump, a Russia-Ukraine war, to come to this conclusion. And even now, we are, as was pointed out, not willing to take the leap and work in a manner that perhaps can give us dividends. It is a reflection of this reality that, at a certain level, domestic priorities will always take precedence over this larger idea of economic security. Because if you have to give quick results, then for politicians, local politics matters, and strategic politics becomes a long-term bet that they may or may not be willing to take. But I think we are looking at a shift. Certainly, with all the challenges that we have been discussing, we know that certain kinds of shifts have happened. In India, we saw post COVID and post-20, it was a double shock in 2020 because not only COVID happened, but also the Galwan crisis, the border crisis with China happened. And I think after that, there was a certain certitude in policy making that that business as usual would not be the norm, that certainly economic relationship cannot be the primary driver of this of the bilateral relationship. We will have to revisit certain assumptions, and India did revisit a certain set of assumptions. And I think now, under the stress of Mr. Trump, under the stress of economic challenges that the world is facing, a certain recalibration has happened between India and China. But that recalibration is only to say that, look, we are going back to the diplomatic status quo ante that existed before 2020. On the larger economic questions, the consensus remains that India not only will build resilience by diversifying its partners, by investing in alternative supply chains, but also will start looking at internal resilience. So you have this whole logic of self-reliance, which is also, I think, coming to in some ways, what you look at, when you look at Mr. Trump's domestic economic policy, when you look at Europe talking about domestic economic resilience, I think you see, the evidence that domestic capacity is being looked at as a very important variable, even as you build supply chain resilience with your like-minded partners. But I do think that this story gets a bit more complicated because of Mr. Trump's behavior in the last few months, since in his second term, because the uncertainty that he has unleashed is making it very difficult to make the kind of choices that perhaps many of these countries would be making, and much faster. I think now there is a step back, a pause, that let's wait and watch, and that creates its own set of disincentives going forward, because time is not, let's be honest, time is not on our side. Those who want to create a non-red economic supply chain structure, because China continues to move on, China continues to trade, China continues to create new realities on the ground, both economic and strategic, and I think we are left responding to it. And if your most important partner like the US is not giving you that space to maneuver, then I think it puts more pressure on countries like all of us. And therefore, I think it may be a lot of the conversations that we now see should be having At one point it was China +1. I think maybe US -1, or Indo-Pacific minus US. I think somewhere, although it is difficult to visualize, but I think unless we start looking at both China and the US as two addendums, and the middle powers in the region, the regional powers start taking ownership of this process, it would be very difficult to conceive of a reality in which we are creating something concrete. And I think that's the danger that Mr. Trump has unleashed. And I think we are all living with that.
Thank you. I thank all the panelists who has made a tremendous interesting remark on these issues. And now we have about like 10 minutes. So let's open the floor. And when you ask a question, please tell us which speaker that you want the answer. Okay, go ahead.
I'm Admiral Chauhan, and my question is actually not directed at a specific speaker. Anybody can answer it. My question is twofold. First of them is that when Mr. Trump, is America not looking at supply chains at all? Is it that he doesn't want any supply chains? He wants to onshore everything? And how will that then play into the manner in which the Indo-Pacific moves in the subject that you are currently discussing? Harsh has already mentioned this in a number of manners, but I'm quite unclear about where we would go. And the second is with regard to critical minerals and their involvement in the supply chain. Now, I want to give you a very quick answer that India has established an organizational setup called Kabil, and the job of Kabil is to go from country to country identifying where critical resources might well be found, critical minerals. But that is not part of this discussion, that what the track 1 and track 2 should be doing, or track think tanks should be doing, is determining how will those critical minerals move. Which ships, how many ships, which shipping lanes, which are the international shipping lanes which will be impacted. We aren't developing these issues, so just as we have supply chain focus on, say, for example, crude oil and its movement, we don't have similar attention being paid to how is this actual critical raw minerals going to move from the points where it is located to the points where it is going to be processed and refined, assuming that those points in question are not in China. So I think that would you like to indicate whether or not think tanks ought to cooperate in this even before countries begin to cooperate in this? Thank you.
I think, Yiren, you want to answer the question about the critical mineral?
Thank you for the question. I was using the conversation at Canada, Ottawa, and Toronto as example to demonstrate that democracies are not talking to each other, especially establishing consensus, especially among the dialogue of Mongolia, Australia, and Canada. And you could see, there is not just no consensus, but people are still, countries are still playing the game that only focusing on individual countries' national interest. So another example, for example, Jeremy was talking about semiconductor. Let me share with you, Taiwan, of course, is #1 country as semiconductor, but we are looking at next generation semiconductor with silicon-based and photonics-based for next generation semiconductor. But we know Japan is #1 country in photonics, but it is just too difficult to persuade Japan to have cooperation with Taiwan at the combination of silicon-based and photonic-based next generation semiconductor. And the difficulty I'm talking about here is not at governmental level. Even at like track 1.5 at think tank level, it is very difficult because, you know, no matter how good your persuasion is, they still want one-minded to invest at Reputus, 2 nano silicon base. That Taiwan is already being so terrific at that kind of RDM manufacturing. Yeah, and it is so difficult to persuade our friends to work together. And third problem is the reason why I was using undersea cable as example is, you know, regardless how serious the problems countries facing against China, you still have problem recognizing Taiwan as a country. And not to mention, you don't have the step one, not to mention you have further, you know, meaningful cooperation with Taiwan. Yeah. So as of Trump, I mean, bad-mouthing about Trump is, of course, very easy. But I want to offer a different perspective to you to think again. If you look the past decades, I mean, India might be different, but if you look at Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, all the central themes of our foreign policy intertwine at 3 themes. Number one, we want the U.S. firm protection, but at the same time, we don't want to get in trouble, U.S. cause. Number two, we want the U.S. firm protection, but at the same time, we want autonomy. Number three, we want U.S. firm protection, but we want economic interest from China. So that's exactly the main themes of foreign policies among all those countries. That's the problem. Yeah. So bad-mouthing about Trump is easy, but rethinking our own perspective, that's difficult.
Okay, Harsh, do you want to talk about the first question about the onshoring problem of Trump?
No, I think Trump, Mr. Trump doesn't want, to an extent that one can comprehend his economic, vision. It is more focused on internal. I think he's right that it's more about recalibration between ends and means. So there, I think he has certainly done well in terms of focusing on what the internal requirements might be. But one of the challenges that even with Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump's predecessors that Indo-Pacific countries had always complained about was that, look, when you had conveyed it to Washington, when we also did, that America's Indo-Pacific policy since, at least since Mr. Biden and Trump 1.0, had largely been about strategic posturing and not about economic rebalancing in the region, where China continues to dominate in so many ways. So the argument that many countries made is that unless America provides that in those incentives which allow for these, whether the supply chain restructuring or friendshoring to take place, it would be very difficult to imagine an alternative economic arrangement where China is not at the heart of that nodal structure. And I do think that that argument remains even valid today, that we can talk of, even let's assume that India and the US very soon sign a trade deal and our relations come back to a certain degree of normalcy, and we do end up with say, the Quad dialogue that is no longer happening according to media reports this year. Even if that happens, that doesn't answer the economic argument that many Southeast Asians in particular have asked. And I think that there was a discussion earlier on when a lot of Southeast Asian countries were on the panel, that Southeast Asia had always balanced its economic relationship with China, with strategic relationship with the US. And I think the question that is increasingly relevant now is if America is not willing to look at Indo-Pacific policy as from a comprehensive point of view, which is, I think, one of the themes of this panel, that what is the comprehensive assessment of Indo-Pacific? It can't be one track. It has to incorporate all tracks. And unless all the tracks are moving together, it becomes very difficult for America's partners and allies to have a more cohesive understanding of where America is coming from. And I think that's the challenge we are facing. So he may not, I think he might be realistic about what perhaps may happen with supply chains. But the uncertainty that he has unleashed would mean that we will take a step back. All the countries would take a step back and determine that, look, we will hedge even more. Now that hedging creates its own set of complications, and I think, again, as I said, I don't think time is on our side. So if the time is on our side, you wanted an administration that could actually focus on multiple things. Now, in theory, I think his idea is certainly very, very valid, that an America and American partners that can share reasonable burden across the Indo-Pacific would be a great idea. That, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, doing their bit in, in their parts of the region, and America chipping in as and when it wants. But I don't think, given the differences and given the architectures that we have created since the end of the Second World War, that it can happen without American leadership in the short to medium term. And therefore, the challenge for all of us is that we have to fight our own battles and look for our own solutions, which are not going to be as comprehensive as perhaps we may have wanted.
Okay, I think it's almost time. So let's, a very short question? No? Let's give a big hands to all the panelists.